Hello, welcome to another installment of Modern Western Buddhism. Today we're going to be covering one of the most important topics to sort of set you up properly in the training of Buddhism, which is the process of going from having heard a teaching to actualizing that teaching in your own mind. And the old Kadam tradition includes a teaching that has a threefold division in that process. There is hearing, there is contemplating, and there is meditating. And the Tibetan word used here is gom, right? Gom is quite similar to the Sanskrit term bhavana, which means development, or more literally, to bring into existence. The Tibetan term, in my understanding, means something closer to become familiar with, or familiarization. So today's installment is going to be about this third facet of the threefold division, which is actually becoming familiar with the teaching. And in my humble opinion, this is maybe the worst understood aspect of these teachings. And I hope that throughout the course of today, we can disambiguate and make quite clear what this process is and why it's actually within reach for you, probably as even a beginner practitioner, but certainly as an intermediate practitioner. This is well within reach, well within grasp. It's something that anyone can do. So this isn't certainly in the formative stages of the process, something that requires that you have full-blown samadhi or full-blown shine. You can do this type of familiarization with much, much, much worse concentration. You do need some concentration, but it doesn't actually have to be that great. So without further ado, let us begin. So we make this large enough for people tuning in at home. First, let's do a very brief review of last time. So last time we were talking about the contemplation stage. In layman's terms, this is just learning to think about what you've heard and retain it and make it very, very rich in terms of all of the content that should be there, right? Pretty much everybody knows if you've heard something once or you've read it in a book a few times, if you're decently sharp and the topic isn't too difficult, most of the time you can pick up, like a kind of general understanding. For example, with music, maybe you've read some books on music theory, right? So when a musician starts talking about, when I play a C major, after that there's such and such chord, there's the minor chord, then a major, so major, minor, minor, major, minor, minor, I can't remember. In any case, within the normal chord progression, there are these chords, etc., etc. However, if you don't have a trained ear, you can't actually hear those chords in a piece of music when they're being played, especially if they're in a if they've been inverted once or twice or three times, or if they have a seventh, a raised seventh, or ninth or 11th or 13th, then the sounds become much less familiar. And so this contemplation process is about taking what would otherwise be kind of rote knowledge about a topic that's quite dry and adding more content to it so that it's quite rich. So to continue with the music example, you sit down at the piano and you play the chords in order so that your ear goes, ah, yes, okay, so When it's the minor chord, it sounds kind of sad. When it's the major chord, it sounds kind of bright. When it's the first chord, it sounds like sort of complete. When it's the fourth chord, it sounds like it wants to lead into maybe the fifth. When it's the seventh, it really wants to come back to the first, and so on and so forth. And that's no longer entirely theoretical. There is a little bit of, there's enough richness to the image that it's not just a word salad in your head anymore, right? So in brief, for people who aren't going to be memorizing all of the textbooks for their Buddhist training, which is the traditional method, the method that I'm recommending here is the one that you've probably already been trained in as a Western person, or a person by and large who's gotten a modern education in almost any country. In other words, take really good notes, right? And make an outline of the text that you're studying. That's sort of step one. And then take notes during your course and combine those with the notes that you've taken on the text for the course that you're in, if it's that sort of thing, and if it's appropriate for the type of course that you're in. And then you start organizing and reorganizing the notes that you've taken. So maybe at this point you start making mind maps or flow charts, right? So you start mapping the material out in a visual way, if that helps you. You can enrich the material using all sorts of things. Actually, when you sit down and think about it and you go, oh yeah, when I listened to Kind of Blue by Miles Davis, that's what minor chords sound like, right? They sound like this sad kind of whatever, right? And so these sorts of experiential pieces that you bring into the analysis really make the images in your head much more memorable, and they make them much brighter, much more rich. And this is how you start to make that material express itself in your everyday life and your everyday experience, right? Because first you need to remember the material, and then you need the material to sort of start occurring at the conceptual level without that much effort on your part. And that process won't occur unless you digest this material and start to incorporate it into different experiences that you've had, and arrange it in ways that are quite memorable so that it comes to mind easily. The next big step is, okay, you've been to a couple courses, right? You've been to a couple different courses, you've read a couple different books, you've attended teachings with a couple different teachers, or maybe the same teacher a few times on the same topic. Now, instead of just, yes, Rinpoche, right? Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Instead of just pretending like you're humble and have respect for your teachers and your teachings, take the material that they've given you and put it all in one place. You've gotten 14 teachings on calm abiding. You've been through the Lamrim 4 times. Whatever. Take that material and start to synthesize it into one package so that you can see all of these connections and you start to understand. Here's how part A relates to part B, and so on. And these types of combinations can get very sophisticated, right? I'm not talking myself up, and normally I would never show other people this sort of thing. But again, you can take the notes from huge numbers of readings that you've done on the same topic and start to synthesize them into documents like this that really work for you, where the very best chunk, right, of the teaching is, right, where it's perfect for triggering the correct experience in your mind, or perfect for triggering the correct mental image in your mind, is right there at your fingertips. This is the purpose of taking notes. If you're just throwing them in the closet, your notes are not so useful, right? So then in the course of time, you can incorporate things that are in the oral tradition into what you get from the textual tradition. For example, in the Freedoms and Fortunes, talking about the preciousness of a human rebirth, you can start to pull in, okay, you've been in the Tibetan thing a long time, but maybe you read for the first time the Pali Suttas. And so the question becomes, how do some of these things in the suttas relate to what I'm getting in my other training, in Buddhism? And you can start to pull in the pieces that really, once again, enrich this other understanding that you have. I don't know that I have a perfect example of this. It would take me a minute to find. But in any case, so here's a small example, right? So my background includes some training in Zen. And so even though my main tradition is the Gelug tradition, here's some material that I have from one of my Zen resources, right? And you can find this story relayed in a similar way in the Pali Suttas, and you can find it relayed in a similar way in the Tibetan presentation of the same material, at least insofar as I've seen. So this particular presentation really struck me personally as, oh, wow, it's astonishing that we have this opportunity. This is so rare. And so I put it here in my notes, my particular way of contemplating, so that when I come back to this topic, it will really strike my mind and hit me as deeply as possible. And that's what this resource is for, right? So that is rough combination, right? Where you kind of dump everything in one place, and then refining the combination, which is really starting to take the pieces apart, see what things are connected, how they're connected, and so on. We went over this in some detail last time, so if you'd like to really get all the details, go back to the previous video on contemplation. It was almost 2 hours, so there's quite a lot of material there. Obviously, as you start going through a synthesis process, combining all your notes, you're going to find gaps in your understanding. So generate questions. The next time you see your mentors or your tutors, as the case may be, your teachers, ask them those questions, right? This is how you start to work with the material towards sort of using this raft to actually cross the river, right? If we're actually trying to cross the stream with this raft of words and so on. So if you leave the raft in your closet after you get done with the course, once again, that's not going to be very useful for you. You want something that you continually come back to. Next, analysis. So I described all these tools in a lot of detail in the last video, so I'm not going to go over them again. But there's a lot of sort of tools you can use to start digesting the material in a sort of a stronger way than you would if you were just doing a taught course. I've done a lot of taught courses. I've taken a lot of taught courses, and I can tell you, when some of my instructors are being quite honest, they will say flat out, attending a course like this isn't good enough. It's not good enough. Why is it not good enough? Because I've given you this piece out of a big puzzle in which all the pieces fit together in one system of training. So if all you have is one puzzle piece, you don't actually have a picture of anything. So you need to start creating, at least with one system. This is why I'm saying again and again and again, I'm not trying to become anyone's teacher. I'm just trying to say that I've had good enough teachers who taught me how to train properly. That's the only claim that I'm making. If you want to get to the point where you are also training in a very, very sincere way, you need to master or at least get quite proficient in one map, one complete picture of the path of training. Once you have one map sort of figured out, then you can start looking at other maps. And when I say sort of figured out, I mean maybe after like 10 years of sort of figuring out one map with the help of an extremely qualified individual or individuals. Systematically taking you through that map once or twice a week, in addition to doing the training that goes along with that map. Just having a bunch of maps in your closet somewhere or on your bookshelf isn't going to cut it. You need the personal instruction of someone who knows what all of this means. And if you don't have that, it's very difficult to see how it's going to lead to any kind of profound result. Even within the system, most Buddhist systems that I've seen, they will say, if you read the texts, if you're doing this and that, basically without a teacher, you can get a little bit of taste of meditative training, a little bit of concentration, but not that much usually. And you can improve your character, you can improve your ethics. But if you really want to gain realization in this life, the types of realizations that these texts say are possible, you have to have a teacher. So, once again, all of these tools for digesting the material that you're getting should be sort of understood within the context of training with one teacher in one system for a long period. While maybe doing some of this work, if it's appropriate and helpful, but some of this work you may not really want to get into until you've been in one system a long time. So let's carry on now, and let's talk about this third stage. So, where to begin? Essentially, I'm not going to talk really at all about the union of shamatha and vipassana. This is really occurring at the level of all of the realizations that occur before you gain calm abiding, which to some Buddhists might sound quite strange. But if you're training in the Tibetan systems, you have to remember something. Unless you're training in a system where you get into Tantra right away, which I don't recommend, or you're training in a system like some of the Pali traditions, where the emphasis is pretty much right away on meditation. Some of the Zen systems, Chan systems, are like that as well, where the main training you do right away is the meditative training. At least that's my impression. In essence, all of the realizations of the entire path, stay with me, the actual realizations, the full-blown realizations, occur before you have calm abiding. This is very important. Very, very important. So, the spiritual teacher realization, the preciousness of a human rebirth, impermanence, basically all of the pieces having to do with renunciation, right? So karma, realms of rebirth, etc., occur before you have calm abiding. So when we're talking about meditation, familiarization, mental development, when we're talking about GOM as a more general category, or we're talking about bhavana, mental development, we're talking about doing a bunch of work with your mind to make the mind much, 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 much more likely to be able to accomplish the ultimate results of the training. So, for example, actually we don't need an example. Let's just carry on. So one of the things that I find quite charming from the Tibetan tradition is they have so many stories. There's so many stories that make these things much more rich. And one of the stories that I always found quite interesting, I'm fairly certain it was Venerable Atisha's translator, but someone can correct me if I'm wrong, his Tibetan translator, which I'm assuming must have been Dromtonpa, who was a layperson, by the way. When all of the students of Atisha got together once and they were comparing who had more realizations of the path, it turned out that J. Dromtonpa had the most realizations, if I'm remembering the story correctly. Now, this is quite interesting because he was comparing himself against, I think, one student who had done a lot of memorization and had done a lot of recitation and so on, and another student who had the ability to do samadhi and had done a great deal of concentrated meditation. And so between the three of them, the one who knew the most texts by heart, and the one who could do samadhi, and the one who basically just did translation work, mostly for Atisha, the translator had the most realizations of the path out of all three of them. And I think this sort of thing should be emphasized much more strongly. Because in the beginning, and the beginning is like 20 years of your training, you don't have to have calm abiding to get the work done. You don't have to have samadhi to get the work done. It would be really helpful if you did. But frankly, the calm abiding, the samadhi, is going to be so much easier to gain if you have all of these prerequisites of the lam rim, or all of these prerequisites of mental development. What we would, in the West, we would call them character, right? You need to have a certain type of character to do the work. What type of character? You need to have ethics. You need to be patient. You need to have a ton of perseverance, that when you decide you're going to do something, basically either you're going to get it done or you're going to die trying. You need to have some detachment from material possessions, which means that you should cultivate generosity to start opening your hand a little bit, right? You need to have unbelievable patience in the face of failure, right? In the face of failure, which you will do a lot in this type of training, you need to have unbelievable long-term kinds of perspectives. In other words, basically it doesn't matter how many times you screw up, how hard it is, what kind of difficulties arise, you will see it through. So you have to develop all of this character first. Also, among what I might call character are things like renunciation, right? Which doesn't mean that you need to move to a cave. Renunciation means you're no longer convinced that by screwing with your reality, it will make you happy. You're no longer convinced that by getting a bunch of stuff that you want in the world and getting rid of a bunch of stuff you don't want in the world, that will make you feel better in any kind of lasting sense. You're almost entirely convinced or entirely convinced that you have to turn the mind inwards to find true peace, true satisfaction. That's it. It doesn't mean you have to live in the woods, even though I kind of do live in the woods. Okay. I don't want to belabor the point. So, how do you gain all of these character traits? You've got to think about this stuff. It's not rocket science. You need to sit down and really think hard about it. You need to use all the tools in terms of contemplation that we talked about, that we're familiar with as Western people and modern people, for digesting the material that you're looking at and making it a really, really, really powerful set of understandings in your own head. It's not rocket science. You do it all the time, actually. So before we go further, let's just talk about sort of very briefly the Tibetan way of talking about this first. So in Pabonka Rinpoche's just astonishing text on the Lam Rim, on the stages of the path, he talks about two types of meditation at this level that one can do and must do in order to go from basically understanding these things at a conventional, sort of having a correct conceptual image rather, right, that you just get it intellectually, to having what they call a contrived realization, which in layman's terms means you have to think about all the pieces of the argument. You have to think about all the aspects of the argument in order to generate the actual experience that we're talking about. They call that contrived or constructed because you have to build it. And then the spontaneous realization, which means that in essence you've become so familiar with that material that that's how you are. So this is really quite helpful to understand in a martial arts sort of way or a music sort of way. So let's just very briefly discuss two analogies and then we'll carry on. In the martial arts in general, they teach you how to stand properly to do your martial art. This is very common. In the beginning, you look at somebody and they say, when you stand this way, your posture is very strong. And it's just a conceptual understanding, right? You have no experience of your posture being strong when you stand in such and such a way, right? It's just like words. Maybe you trust those words because they're from someone who seems quite strong, but you don't know for yourself. And then you go through a constructed realization process where to actually feel strong, you have to remember, my foot needs to be like this. My knee needs to be at 45 degrees. My hips need to be sunk. My back needs to be straight. My shoulders need to be rolled back and kind of coming down my back, and my hands need to be in a favorable position. You understand? My neck need not be dipped down. My head needs to be pulled up out of my torso, and so on. And at that point, it's a constructed understanding, right? It's still experiential. You know that if you do these 5 or 6 things with your body, it will be stronger from direct experience. And then at some point, after training for 2 or 3 years perhaps in that martial posture, that's just how you are. When you go to the grocery store to buy an orange, that's how your posture is. It's just always strong in the best possible position. Is this making sense? And so now your realization of that posture is spontaneous. It has become how you are. So this isn't actually some mystical weird thing that only applies to Buddhist mind training stuff. This is the normal process of learning anything that is serious. We might also say, again, you could read a music textbook and learn that the first chord in the major scale is always major, the fifth is major, and the rest are minor, etc., right? And intellectually you go, okay, major chords, minor chords, I can repeat those words back to you, and maybe they have a little bit of meaning for me. And then you pick up your guitar and you play a C major, right? C. And then maybe you play a G major in the same, within the same, what's the word I'm reaching for? Within the same scale, right? So you then know from experience that the C and the G have a similar type of quality that is sort of bright and happy. And then at some point, you're no longer thinking, oh, C is a major, this is a minor, that's a major, blah, 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 blah. You just go, I want to create a mood that is uplifting. And the sounds that you create that come to mind are easily available, right? Your hand just finds the right place for that sound to come out without you having to consciously go through this big constructive process. Yes, I need to go from the fourth chord to the fifth to the this to the that. It's just you're just able to play, right? So this is the normal process of learning, where you go from having heard something and it's just sort of an intellectual understanding that you can remember, to going to, okay, now I have to work really hard to construct the actual correct experience of the thing. And then finally, you no longer have to think about it. You no longer need the conceptual images. You are like that when you do that thing, or when it's relevant, you're like that. So, in terms of Gom, at this level, we're not talking about the final levels where you're combining calm abiding and special insight meditation into one phenomena. We're talking about all the work you need to do to be able to do calm abiding at the end. So Pabonka Rinpoche recommends two methods, right? One method could be aptly called a reviewing meditation. In other words, he says you're standing on top of a mountain, but not many people these days have stood on the top of a mountain. So instead, you can think about it like there's a map in front of you, and you're just pointing to the map and going, that's California, that's Texas, that's South Carolina, that's this, that's that, right? You're not actually going to each of these places and looking at all the details, which would be an experience of that place. So in the same way, when you're doing sort of each, in essence, when you're just simply trying to recall the correct order of stuff on whichever pedagogy you're in, whichever system of training you're in, you just recall it quickly. Yes, the preciousness of a human rebirth, there are 8 freedoms, there are 10 fortunes, the 8 freedoms are up, the 10, blah, 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 blah. So you're not actually generating the experience. You're just trying to keep those understandings fresh so that they don't disappear. Okay. Obviously, the danger with this method is if you don't understand what this method is for, you can get quite arrogant about just knowing a bunch of Dharma stuff. You become what my previous mentor used to call a philosophical monster. You can answer every question correctly, and you don't know a single thing. You have zero actual experience of those teachings. And at some point, Pabonka Rinpoche warns about this a number of times. Basically, if you get too enamored with the respect and the whatever that comes from knowing a bunch of Dharma stuff, you can completely veer off the path and actually break yourself in such a way that those teachings will never, for the rest of this lifetime, have the effect that they need to have on your mind. In other words, you have taken a system that was intended to affect you at the deepest possible level and change what you are, and turned it into a chess game of intellectual sort of debate, right? It's a huge mistake. It's a huge trap. And in particular for people that are very smart and have the ability to handle a lot of information, a lot of detail really quickly, this is the biggest trap there is. Because the intellectual understanding isn't the experience. And this should become quite clear as we go along here. So to sort of just speak very briefly, right? Very, very briefly. If you are reading a text, for example, and some critical point of that teaching strikes you and you go, whoa, that's an unbelievably important point. I can't believe I didn't see that. Wow. Take a moment. Take a few minutes with as much concentration as you can muster and hold that shift in your perspective. This is sort of the most basic advice on how to do what the Tibetans would call familiarization, right? And actually, when it comes to counterproductive familiarizations, we do this all the time, right? You meet somebody and you don't like them. You don't know why you don't like them. You just don't like them. And so because you feel like you don't like them, there's this experience of, wow, I really don't like them. Then you look at them and you go, you know what, they're kind of ugly too. And then you go, yeah, maybe I don't like them because they're ugly. And then they say something, and it's actually not bad, right? They seem like a decent person. But then your mind is looking. It's looking for some justification for this feeling. I really don't like this person. And so time goes on. Then they say something that you don't like or don't agree with. And you go, there it is, right? Now I really don't like this person. And so that experience of not liking them is continually reinforced by your mental habit of looking for a new fault, looking for something else to justify the feeling, looking for something else to reinforce the pattern, the habit that you already have regarding this being, this person, this object, this situation, whatever it is. And so you keep up or you keep regenerating this feeling of, I really don't like them. I really want to get away from this. I hope they never talk to me, right? And so we go through that process a lot in our ordinary daily activities, where the Tibetans call this inappropriate attention. Some feeling occurs regarding a person, a situation, an object, whatever it is, and we go through an elaborate process of continually justifying, rejustifying, thinking about, looking at the situation from 17 different angles. Some people even go really nuts with this stuff, and they write out lists of here's how this person hurt me, and they got me like this, and this happened, and then right? Or we meet a new person that we really like, and we have a romantic interest, and then we sit down and we're like, the color of their hair, it's just like, right? And so we go through these long processes of thinking about an issue from 17, 10, 100 different angles to justify and reinforce the way that we feel about that person, situation, and so on. That ongoing contemplation, chewing it up, continually trying to refresh and keep that mental habit in place is this training, right? So right now, we maybe have a mental habit that's automatic. A lot of people, when you see an attractive person on the street, you go, oh. And you don't have to work hard at all. That, when you see an attractive person, you can't help but stare at them as they go by or whatever. You already have that mental habit. Attractive object, look at it as long as you can, right? Spontaneous. You don't have to construct it. You don't have to work on it. When the attractive object is there, you stare at the object or person or whatever. So all of these meditative endeavors prior to gaining calm abiding are like that. You spend a lot of time drilling into an issue, looking at it from 17 different angles, 100 different angles, until you have actually generated whatever that state of mind or realization or sort of actualization of that thing is. At first you construct it, it's artificial. And then as you go through that process day after day, week after week, it becomes spontaneous. You don't have to do any work. That's just how you are, right? To use the opposite example, in a lot of the sort of classic Buddhist texts on meditation, there are a ton of meditations looking at the ugliness of the human body. Why? Because we find human bodies extremely distracting. Right? And so in the texts, there are all of these descriptions of the grossest parts of the human bodily functions and the death process and what happens to the body, what's inside the body. Shantideva's descriptions of these things are hilarious. If you haven't read the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, you definitely should at least read that section because they're quite entertaining. He goes, if you really think carefully about it, I'm paraphrasing, if you really think carefully about it, the human body, it's almost like a beautiful bag that's just filled to the brim with absolutely disgusting substances. And he says, if you don't believe me when I say that, he said, when a person gets the tiniest of cuts, everyone's disgusted. Right? So if you can even see like the smallest amount inside the body, everyone is horrified and disgusted. So it's just this bag holding a bunch of things that everyone finds horrifying and disgusting. I find his descriptions quite hilarious. He also said, we find dead bodies really horrifying and disgusting. But this is a dead body with a mind in it. And so there's basically all these corpses walking around that have minds temporarily. So he said, why do you find the living one so attractive and the dead one so unattractive? Right? Anyway, so these things go on and on. Why? Because if you're trying to train the mind, for example, to stay on an object of meditation, it's going to be really helpful to not have the mind be distracted by attractive bodies, whichever types of bodies you happen to be attracted to. So this is really where we get into what I'm calling rumination meditation. I think technically, from the Gelug perspective, this would be called analytic meditation, i.e., it would be called vipassana. But because special insight is, I think, most usefully understood only in the context of a person who's already attained calm abiding, I don't know that for people with a more casual understanding of these issues that it's really helpful to conflate these two things. Even if it's accurate, I don't know that calling them the same thing is very helpful at this level. So for the sake of just sort of getting your hands around what it is that you need to be doing in order to go from no realizations to having some actual realizations of the Buddhist path, I think it's helpful to think about this initial stage as being a different thing, even if it's in the continuum with this more profound thing, which arguably it is. So what is this work that you're doing when you're ruminating? It's a kind of fancy way of saying you think about it. Well, you can do sort of an informal or a formal thing in terms of rumination, but this is really seeking to maximize the impact of your study and contemplation by using all the focus you can muster to hold subjective objects, meaning emotions and mental states, objective objects, meaning conceptual images, right? Correct conceptual understandings, or a blend of the two simultaneously. So here's a geshe, since I have no qualifications of any kind. Here, take it from the mouth of someone who's quite well known and quite well respected. So analytic meditation involves thinking and can be done anywhere. In fact, we do plenty of analytical meditation, but of the wrong sort. For instance, someone has hurt your feelings. The more you mull it over, the more you feel like humiliating that person publicly. This wish becomes so strong that you devise a strategy. When you have a reliable plan, you carry it out and finally take satisfaction in what you've accomplished. Exactly the same procedure can be used positively. For example, you meet someone in trouble and want to help them. You think about the various ways in which you could alleviate their difficulties and decide upon an appropriate course of action. Then you implement it to the best of your ability, acknowledge whatever you achieve with satisfaction, and so on and so forth. In brief, it's important not to be too rigid about the distinction between meditation and implementation, or to think that meditation always means sitting in a certain position. I couldn't say it any more succinctly or any better than that. So the advice that you find sort of scattered throughout the Tibetan traditions here and there, Dzongsa Rinpoche has some wonderful advice on this very thing in his text, The Guru Drinks Bourbon. He has just one or two paragraphs on this. And basically he says, from time to time, a wave of inspiration will strike you, right? You're looking in the mirror and you've been training hard in concentration or maybe just bodily awareness, say, for a day or 2 days or 3 days for whatever reason. Maybe you've been training in Tai Chi or something, right? And you're looking in the mirror and it becomes completely obvious that you are not the body. And it becomes completely obvious that the body is just a set of causes and effects that has nothing to do with a self, right? Now, you didn't work to do that. You weren't trying to do that. You were just looking in the mirror and it struck you because of work that you've done previously and because the conditions were right. It would be a huge waste if you just went, oh yeah, that's cool, and you turned around or you just like went on with brushing your teeth or whatever. To not waste those spontaneous moments where the path is occurring to you without effort in this moment, it would be a tragedy. In those moments where certain aspects of the path occur to you, take that time, sit down, stand up, continue walking down the street, wherever you happen to be, and just hold that change with as much focus as you can muster. And simply holding those things for longer periods of time means that you're increasing the impact of those momentary experiences. So thinking about it like a pond, right? If you drop a small rock in the pond, you get little tiny ripples. So that's sort of like it spontaneously occurred to you, oh wow, the body is not the self. It's just causes and effects. A little tiny rock dropped in the pond. But if you take that moment and you extend it for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you've just dropped a much bigger rock in the pond, haven't you? You've created a much bigger effect from that momentary experience. So rumination is sort of either formal or informal, but it entails alternating between as much some analysis, right? Or some sort of, you're working on some aspect of the path in terms of understanding, and then holding with as much focus as you can, whatever the conclusion is. To put it briefly, you think about it, something occurs, you hold it with concentration. Or you're brushing your teeth, something strikes you, you stop brushing your teeth for a few minutes, and you just hold with concentration. You're reading a book, the understanding of the topic explodes in your mind, and you hold that understanding. In brief, that is all. This is the process that you use to realize all of the topics that come before gaining calm abiding. It's not mystical, it's not magical, it's not incomprehensible. It's entirely common sense. Okay? So you can do this. You can really do this. You don't have to wait until you're some Buddhist saint to start gaining realizations of the path. So let's continue on with sort of the notes here. I don't want to go on too long today because that's really the essence of the topic. What I've said so far is, I think, enough for most people to start doing this. But since I tend to be the slow, stubborn one who doesn't understand things, I also think it can be quite helpful to over-explain, which is why some of these videos are so long. But if all of that made sense, you can tune out now. So, as I already said, in the Lamrim presentations of the path, calm abiding comes very near the end. It's basically the second to last step in the path of training in the Gelug system, which means that you can and must realize everything else on the path before you have the ability to do actual meditation. Take a few minutes and really digest that. So you don't need to become a great yogi to get 90% of the realizations of the path. However, you do need those realizations with some force to gain calm abiding. So if your seated training isn't going well, it's because you don't have the character traits that come from the earlier, more basic parts of the training. That's why it doesn't work. There's one quite prominent Hindu teacher who says meditation is not a skill, it's a result. He says, if you want flowers to grow in your garden, you plant a seed, and then you forget about flowers, and you just make sure the soil is right, and the water is right, and the amount of heat is right, the pH is right, and so on. Again, this is exactly what the text is saying if you read the Lamrim carefully. You need to prepare all the conditions properly, and then when you try to attain calm abiding, it'll happen in like 4 to 6 months. It will happen quite quickly. It's preparing the conditions that are really, really difficult. So, in terms of doing ruminations on different types of topics, there are, in terms of a more general presentation of meditation, there are 2 types of objects, right? Objective objects are things that are not subjects. Subjects are things that are not objects. Come on, pick it up. Let's go. Objective objects are things like the breath, right? Despite what you may have read in scientific literature, your breath is external to your mind. So it is an object that your mind takes as an object. The physical sensation of the breath is not internal to the mind. It is external to the mind. So objective objects are anything that are external to the mind. Subjective objects are objects that the mind must itself transform into in order to meditate upon. So in the first case, an objective object is something like a visualized Buddha. A visualized Buddha is generated by the mind, but it's not the mind. An image of the breath is a representation of the sensations occurring on your skin right here by your nose or wherever you happen to be, whatever part of your body you're using to track the breath. It's a mental representation of that. If you're generating the mind into compassion or into loving kindness, the mind itself is being generated into that state of loving kindness. So that is a subjective object of meditation. In other words, you think about, oh, how wonderful would it be if all sentient beings had happiness, right? and you think about this from a whole bunch of different angles, and you lay the foundation for this mind, which is a quite extensive process actually. It's a very difficult mind to generate. You lay all this groundwork, etc., etc., and then, you actually feel, may all beings have happiness. Right? I really hope it turns out well for them, and that they have everything they need so that things go well. That their training proceeds in such a way that they can actually gain a true state of satisfaction. And the mind itself is generated into that mental state, right? So this is different than like visualizing a Buddha and holding the image, or following the breath and just having a mental representation of the sensation of the breath as the focal point of the meditation. Okay, I don't want to belabor that point, so let's carry on. Okay, yeah. So when you're doing rumination meditation, your objects are going to be more or less going to be emotions that are generated and mental states that are generated as you contemplate the various subjects of the Lamrim, or whichever training system you happen to be involved in. You find amongst the bhavanas of the Pali traditions all sorts of contemplations, right? Like if lust is your big problem, they have contemplations for those. If anger is your big problem, they have contemplations for those. If, jealousy is your big problem, and so on and so forth. There are antidotes to specific major problems if that's what's plaguing you. And so when the opposite of anger arises in the mind, I think in terms of all Buddhist psychological models, they would consider patience to be the opposite of anger. So when patience occurs, which is, I think I would classify that as a mental factor, so a mental state, not an emotion, that the mental factor of patience is the thing that's held in meditation, right? On the other hand, you might have an object like impermanence, where the focal image initially, in the end, you cognize impermanence directly, but initially, to know what you're looking for when you're looking for impermanence, the image is conceptual, right? So you're reading the text and you're reading Dharmakirti, and he says there are two types of subtle impermanence. The first one is such and such. The second one is that even within a single split instant moment, there is no abiding. So there is no such thing as, even in a single instant moment, the smallest divisible point of sort of point of time in which something stays what it is. And you go, oh, wow, okay, conceptually I get that now, that if it was abiding for a single second, there would be no cause in that moment for it to arise as something else. It is what it is, and it would stay what it is because there's no change. So even in a single moment, it must remain what it is. It must be changing, i.e. it must be momentary, right? And that image, that conceptual image, which doesn't have a picture or a sound or anything associated with it, just the understanding image occurs in the mind, and you hold that understanding image with as much focus as you can. Bang. Oh, like the aha, right? The aha. Oh, wow, I got that. Boom. And you hold that aha with as much focus as you can. So that would be an objective object, the mental image, the correct conceptual understanding of impermanence. By holding that conceptual image for a period of time, the analogy that's used in the middle-length Lamrim, Je Tsongkhapa, he says he's quoting the Buddha. He's actually quoting the Buddha Vamsa, so he's quoting, I think, Buddha Kasyapa or Kasapa. In any case, he says, when two trees rub together in the wind, they produce heat, and with enough heat, they'll produce fire, right? So like that, your correct conceptual understanding of impermanence will eventually catch fire and burn down the trees, right? So in the Tibetan systems inherited from Nalanda, so the Indian Buddhist tradition, which was a blended tradition of both Mahayana and Theravada teachings, are making the argument that first you have the conceptual understandings, those become quite strong, they have a real effect on your behavior. You do further training, and your understanding gets very, very, very subtle conceptually, and it gets, basically you get to the point where your training in meditation is sufficient that you cognize what's going on directly. And that burns down the need for these conceptual images, right? But, for the rest of us, for the next 20 years or 30 years or whatever, while we're developing character, we need to have very, very sharp conceptual images, right? So at this level of the training, for normal people like you and me, this is what's being talked about. It's really not discussing that you need to unify a rarefied state of meditative capability with another rarefied state of meditative capability. This is very earthy stuff, very practical stuff. So how do we connect the notes and the system that we discussed previously with this new thing, the familiarization, the mental development, the meditation? So you take the resource that you've built, right? Just like this one here that I've created for Persistence of a Human Rebirth. So you take this document and you start to go through the document, right? And you can do this a couple ways. As you see here, right? In mine, I have a rumination section where I'll spend some time going through. Okay, here's the 17 different ways this is talked about. Okay, wow. Yeah, that one really hits the mark. Now let me think about this. Here's 2 or 3 analogies that really make that work. Oh. And then it hits me and I go, and I grab what has struck me with as much focus as I can, right? And I hold that for a while, and then it starts to degenerate. It starts to, what you're generating here are changing things, right? So they will degenerate over time. That's the nature of changing things. So as it degenerates, it gets to a point where it's no longer sort of creating an effect in the mind. And so maybe I reread what I just read. Here's the 2 analogies. And it hits me again, maybe with the same force. Great. If it's starting to get a bit stale, then I move on to the next point, right? Because the point here is to start creating movement in your mind. And it's not like you're just going to stay on this one topic for the next 10 years. You're going to make some progress on a topic, then move on to the next one, then the next one, then the next one, and then you come back and you start over and you go again. At some point, Pabonka Rinpoche recommends that you do stick it out and stay with one topic for 3 months, 6 months, 5 years, whatever it takes to generate the final realization of that topic. But again, for most people, take your time. You need to go through this material several times first, get the overview, and then start to drill in. And I don't know if I have it in this text or not. Well, Pabonka Rinpoche recommends essentially that you go through your entire system of learning about the Dharma 2 or 3 times first, and just get the overview, right? This gives you the ability, in theory, with some humming and hawing perhaps, to talk about what the whole path structure is like, how we know that yes, step 1 will lead to step 2 will lead to step 3, and so on. You have a general understanding that is stable. Great. Now you need to go back and start going through the whole process and generate the constructed realizations. In other words, you start with topic 1 and you do whatever's required to generate the experience of the preciousness of a human rebirth, which means that it hits you so powerfully in the face that you start to cry. Oh, this is so precious. It's so rare, it shouldn't have even happened. It's unbelievable when you look at the odds against having the opportunities that I have right now, right? And you construct that level of genuine, sincere, internal sort of recognition of the issue, where it genuinely raises the hair on your arms. It genuinely, maybe makes you sweat, makes tears come from your eyes, where it is a powerful, motivating force in your psychology. Then Pamonk Rinpoche recommends, okay, you've done that for the first topic of the Lam Rim. Now go to the second topic. Construct that one so that you can generate the second Lam Rim topic as a constructed realization. Then the third, and so on and so on and so on. And then you go back again. And it's only at that point when you can basically generate every Lam Rim realization in a contrived manner that you then start to actually realize the spontaneous realizations of each stage of the path. In other words, you become sort of scholarly, you get a scholarly kind of overview that's intellectual. Then you get an experiential overview that is constructed, and so you have some competency in each aspect of the path. And then you go back and you gain real expertise, right, in terms of experience, where that becomes who you are. That's what a realization is. A better word is perhaps actualization. It becomes real for the first time. You don't construct it. You don't have to think about it. When you go to bed at night, it is automatically present that this life is incredibly precious and time is precious. And if you waste it, it's a horrifying tragedy. That's always there. When you wake up, when you're brushing your teeth, when your boss is yelling at you, always present. Why? Because it's spontaneous. You're so familiar with that understanding that you don't have to do anything for that understanding to be present. So after doing that with the preciousness of a human rebirth in the Gelug system, then you proceed on to the next one, the next one, the next one. And in this way, you then become extremely proficient in each stage of the training. Now, at this point, you should be prepared by the time you get to calm abiding to actually generate samadhi for the first time. Right? You've probably been training in some seated sessions and all this before then. Hopefully you have. But it's really not until you have the full capabilities of having generated all the previous stages that you'll be able to generate the next stage in a real sort of flawless way. That's why the system is set up in the way that it is. And it says all over the place, you cannot realize these things out of order. You need to realize them in order, right? And insofar as I know, this is basically a common feature to all Buddhist traditions. Yes, some people sort of wake up on a Tuesday and go to a meditation retreat, and they come out on Wednesday or Thursday or whatever, and they are never the same. And their practice is very profound, basically, right from that moment. But that's not me. That's probably not you if you're watching this video. So we need to do it the sequential, gradual, step-by-step kind of way, right? If you're not that kind of person and you have like this incredible drive, desire, perseverance, and all of this right away, I doubt you're watching my videos, first of all. But more generally, I mean, you would probably be kneeling outside a Zen monastery as we speak, you know, or you would be traveling halfway across the world to train with the best teacher in this particular subject. And you would do whatever it took, right? Or die trying. So if that's not you, and instead you're sitting here watching my videos, then like me, you need to do these things in order, starting with the easiest thing, which is just understanding what the hell it is you're trying to do, and then constructing each piece, and then actually realizing each piece, which is enough work, I think, for a lifetime. Okay, let's carry on. So actual sessions, as we already said, this can be formal or informal. Quite frequently, if you're just doing study and contemplation, things will just occur on their own in the course of going through the study and the contemplation. So hold them as they come. That is incredibly profound advice. You will find highly realized meditators providing that advice in the Tibetan tradition. That's not just me kind of waving my hands over here. This is the advice of experts. As you're sort of going through a session of study in the course of maybe an hour or 2 hours or whatever you've devoted to study for that day, you'll find, for example, that, you know, something erupts in your experience. You hold that, and then you carry on with the study, and you're thinking a bit more, whatever, you're going through the outline that you built on the preciousness of the human rebirth, and something else occurs, and you hold it. So this is sort of an informal rumination, right? You didn't really set out to do a rumination meditation. You're just taking advantage of whatever pops up. In a more formal way, you can, I think this is loosely based upon Pavanka Rinpoche's advice, but I may have slightly modified it. Essentially, you can do a complete overview, right? Where you say, okay, today I'm going to do all of the 18 freedoms and fortunes. I'm going to do all of these. And you do not move on from the first freedom until the actual contrived realization occurs in your experience, right? So you're not just going through all 18 and something pops up when it happens to pop up and you hold it, right? You basically are being quite stubborn that you will not move on from point 1 until you have the experience of point 1. The second way is maybe all 18 points is way too ambitious, right? Maybe for most of us to go through 18 points and generate each realization of those points is too demanding. So you start with maybe one portion. Maybe you're going to do the 8 freedoms only. Okay. Or maybe you're going to do 4 of the 8 freedoms, the ones that pertain to the human realm, right? Okay, I'm going to do all those. Or maybe you're going to do just one topic within those 4. I wasn't born in a barbaric land. So if you've chosen to just do the one, yeah, you do not leave that session until the contrived realization, the constructed realization of that experience comes up. So in this case, take a moment. Do you think this is a objective object or a subjective object? Now, there will be a quiz at the end. Kidding aside, this is going to be a subjective object, right? So there should be a sense of relief, a sense of joy, a sense of appreciation, perhaps. There should be a host of positive emotions that pop up when you really penetrate the idea that you weren't born somewhere, that more or less the meaning of this in sort of modern vernacular is that you were not born in a place where you would have never encountered these teachings, right? The Dharma teachings, that is. Not my teachings, because I'm full of crap. So the notion of the barbaric, and I'm not sure what the Tibetan underlying this is, but essentially I think it's sometimes translated as like a remote land, a remote place with sort of people who have backward kind of customs or something as the implication. Maybe not super PC these days, but that's not the point. So when the joy arises, oh wow, I really was born in a place where gaining access to these teachings was possible. Even if it took me a long time to do that, I could have instead been born somewhere where I would have never heard any of this. Wow, that was really lucky, right? And that feeling of whoa comes up, and you hold that as a subjective object. The joy, the relief, the appreciation. Wow. You hold that. Now, the third method is doing a complete rumination on one topic, but only stopping on the points where you have a lot of difficulty. So maybe the point about, I don't know, the one that we covered last time, right? Maybe the point about being born with incomplete faculties. That might be quite difficult. It might be difficult for political reasons. It might be difficult for personal reasons. It might be difficult for all sorts of reasons. Some of which might be valid and some of which might not be valid. And so those points that are quite difficult, you need to spend more time than the other points really looking at that, right? So to use a martial arts sort of analogy, if you know that your right shoulder is all screwed up, and that because of that, you can't throw a proper punch, or you can't, in the Tai Chi world, there's a lot of discussion about sort of releasing the tissue so that the bones are the main thing holding up the body, and the tissue is just kind of released onto the bones, at least at the initial level, which is where I am. I'm not an advanced martial arts person. And so maybe because of an old injury, like I have some kind of old injury in my right shoulder, I don't know where it came from. Maybe because of that, you can't release the tissue properly in the front of the shoulder and the back of the shoulder. And so you need to go get a massage, and you need to have hot stone treatments, and you need to have acupuncture, whatever, right? Physical therapy. Maybe you need to do some weightlifting to strengthen the right muscle groups that aren't in the right spot, whatever it is, so that that shoulder functions properly and now can be made serviceable for the training. So in the same way, as you're going through, maybe you chose like the first 4 of the freedoms. As you're going through, maybe 2 of them, immediately you go, wow, I'm so happy I'm free from that condition. Whoa, I'm so happy I'm free from that condition. Meh. Wow, I'm so happy, right? So the ones where you don't get the feedback you're supposed to be getting from the exercise, you need to work harder sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes you need to work really hard to go at it from every angle until it occurs. Now, finally, well, that's it really. You can probably see that number 3 is kind of a combination of 1 and 2, right? Then you do a complete overview of one thing and you just stay with the hard parts longer. And so these are all just practical methods, right? These are practical methods to start doing this kind of work. Regarding objective objects and all this sort of the next stuff, these are more from my own understanding. So I apologize if any of these strike the Geshes and other more erudite people as quite strange. But objective objects can come in a number of sort of experiential flavors, right? So, for example, maybe you, and this is actually in the Lum Rim. So, like if you have a particular image of something, a particular understanding, maybe today you're not working on making it more subtle. You're not working on making it more powerful. You just recall what is already quite well established, right? So that's one way you can work on an objective object. You have some kind of understanding of impermanence. Today, you're not working on making it more subtle. You're just trying to make yourself more familiar with that current image that you already possess. So you recall it. Ah, yes. If it's momentary, it has to be this. If it's this, it's ba 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 ba. There it is. Okay, there's the image. Ah, yes, it still has the power that it had, 3 months ago when I thought about it. And you hold it. Yeah? New understandings, you're reading a book, something strikes you. Aha! Wow, how did I not see that the first 6 times? And that image is now quite fresh, quite bright. You hold that. Oh, right? I really do like this. I hope this isn't too boring for most people, but here's Pavanka Rinpoche talking about the difference between contrived and uncontrived realizations, just to drive this home. So, spiritual awarenesses that arise after continuous reflection, right? You've been thinking about it a lot on many scriptural citations. So you're reading the Pali Suttas, you're reading the Mahayana Sutras, you're reading the commentaries by great realized beings, you're attending teachings, and something hits you, right? Maybe you've been in retreat for 3 days with a great teacher of some kind, and bang, it hits you. But it only occurs under those kind of extended study conditions, or maybe not even extended. You have to spend like 3 or 4 seconds thinking about the argument. It's that 1, 2 is 1, 2 plus 1 is 1, 2. Okay, that's 4, right? And you have to go through that work, even if it's really quick. 2, 2, 4, right? That's still contrived. It's not spontaneous because you had to go through a process of thinking about it to generate it. That's what contrived means. You have to build it every time you build it. You can get very good at building it where it happens, boom, right? As far as everyone else is concerned, that seems pretty good. Unfortunately, when you're tired, when you're sick, when you're sore, none of those things are going to occur to you because you don't have the energy, right? Now, this should concern anyone who's been in a kind of Buddhist training circle for more than like 5 seconds, because most Buddhist training has to do with preparing for the moment of death. In one form or another, is preparing to transition well. When you're dying, you're probably going to be sick, you're probably going to be in a lot of pain, there's going to be a lot of distractions around you, you're going to be tired. So all of your realizations need to be spontaneous. If they're not the automatic way that you do things, if they're not the automatic, spontaneous way that you relate with your experience, with your mind, with your internal sensations, etc., then it won't help under demanding conditions. And spontaneous realization needs to be, or rather spontaneous realization is sufficient to handle difficult, challenging, novel circumstances. Contrived, even if it's something that comes like this, is not suitable for dealing with the most challenging circumstances, in particular the moment of death. So, taking a breath, an uncontrived experiential realization is one which arises distinctly as soon as you bring a subject to mind and irrespective of prolonged reflection, like the desire for sense objects that arises in your mind without need of prolonged contemplation. What does this mean? This means you're at the grocery store, you see your favorite brand of candy as you're checking out, and automatically you want it, right? You see the Reese's there? Oh, right? You don't have to do anything for the desire for the Reese's to automatically occur when you see that little orange package. Oh, right? It's just there. So that is the type of familiarity that you need to have with all of the sort of Buddhist mental development tools like renunciation, like preciousness, like impermanence, yada, 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 all of these tools that develop your character, generosity, patience, perseverance, ethics. If there's a time gap between perception and what to do next, then it will not withstand the most demanding conditions. Even in the ordinary sense, it won't stand up to the worst parts of your life. When things get really hard, if your realizations take a few seconds to generate, they won't stand up to the most demanding crap that happens to you in life, even before you die. So, Pamonka Rinpoche's other sort of general advices, he says some spontaneous realizations, right, and contrived realizations come within days. If they come within a few days, you're done with that. Move on to the next thing. He says others will take years. Therefore, do not continue meditating obstinately on those topics for which realizations come easily, and instead move on to the next point. Likewise, don't think that the topics which are difficult are taking too long. Critical point. No matter how long they take, even months or years, continue meditation until you generate the appropriate realization. One need only do review meditation for topics already realized or topics which are further along in the Lam Rim. What does that mean? Another critical point, right? In general, focus single-mindedly as you analyze and contemplate one topic you are currently practicing until the experiential realization occurs, right? So that advice needs to be understood in the context of what's already been said. First, you get the intellectual thing, do a few rounds of your systems training on that so that you understand the whole path. Then you start contriving each realization so that with a little bit of work, you can generate the realizations. And then you start the work of, I'm just going to keep doing this realization until it's spontaneous, period. I will not change, I will not move until I can do this part properly. And his general advice is, when you're thinking about topics further along in the process, you need only do a review, right? Here's California, here's Texas, here's South Carolina, here's this, here's a dup, right? But when you get to the thing that you're actually working on, you drive and dive and go deep, 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 deep in the topic. And you keep doing that every day, every week, every month, every year, for as many decades as it takes for the spontaneous realization to occur. And once again, for most realizations, this is before you have calm abiding. So these aren't rarefied things in that way. Calm abiding is quite difficult and quite advanced. You just need to have some concentration, just a bit. if you're already familiar with the Tibetan way of talking about this, you need like, maybe like second level of shamatha training, which means you can hold an object for like 30 seconds at a time. By the time you get to the third level, you can hold objects for like 2 or 3 or 5 minutes at a time on a good day. And that's plenty to gain every realization you need to gain for the whole path right up to calm abiding. And then you can actually do calm abiding. You can actually gain that on the basis of these other realizations. So that's the Tibetan approach, in my understanding, quite generally. If you're talking about sutra, tantra is different. So in terms of general advice, Jepabonka also recommends a 3-pronged approach, which I find quite fascinating and interesting and relevant. So he says, basically, the meditations having to do with relying properly on the teacher are among the most difficult in the Buddhist tradition. And having been around a while and seen, especially in the West, just sort of the lack of respect and lack of enthusiasm and lack of sort of, I don't know, everybody just wants to be super independent in the West, and nobody really wants to follow the advice of other people. It's quite strange. Not everyone, but we have an independent streak in the West that's quite different from the sort of general Confucian values one might find spread across Asia. So in any case, he says, and remember, he's writing for people that are living in Asia also. He says, this is going to be among the most difficult things of the whole endeavor. Learning how to properly rely on the teacher is one of the most difficult topics in the entire subject of learning how to train in this stuff. So he says, if you can manage it, have 3 sessions of meditative rumination contemplation per day. The first one is on relying on the teacher properly. The second one is on anything in the middle portion of the Lam Rim, but you need to start, again, we're talking, you've already been doing this like 12 years and now you're trying to gain the realizations, right? You need to start with preciousness of a human rebirth, step 1, right? And you just keep driving at that step until you get it. Then you do the next one, then you do the next one. So you're always doing a little bit on the teacher. And then also the third session of the day, you meditate on the first few stages of realizing emptiness, which are recognizing what is the object of negation, right? And object of negation. And then I think it depends on which system you're looking at, but if we're saying initial stages, probably doing one of the contemplations on selflessness rather than the contemplations on the emptiness of phenomenon. Yeah. So all the time, you're alternating between these 3 things. You're always looking a little bit at, okay, how do I rely a little better on the teacher, right? By generating the correct attitudes and motivations to rely on teachers in the right way. Second session, you're always focusing on one issue and continuing to drive at that issue until you get the next part of the path accomplished. The third session, you're always working a little bit on emptiness. Now, for those who have been around for a while, you may have picked up on something quite interesting. In terms of karmic paths, in terms of generating merit, and in terms of purifying negative karma, the advice that he's giving here is extremely profound, right? According to the Tibetan systems, your proper reliance upon the teacher, is the most profound way, or is amongst 2 of the most profound ways to generate merit. If you relate with the teacher properly, you will generate the most powerful positive imprints in your mind, right? So in that way, you have merit squared away. The momentum you're creating will be the most powerful type of momentum. In the second session of the day, you're doing a lot of work to actually try to realize all the stages of the path. In the third session of the day, you're meditating on emptiness, which is the most profound purification practice. So removing negative karma, negative imprints, negative skandhas, negative habituations of mind from the mind. So it's actually really sophisticated advice, isn't it? Do the stuff that generates the most merit, do the stuff that creates the most purification, and in between, do the stuff that will continue to deepen your progress along the path. Very profound, very smart advice. Right. So we could talk a lot more about the emptiness thing, but that's not really the point of these videos. I like Pavank Rinpoche's analogy here because I'm a nature fanatic. So he says it's when you cultivate these meditations in this way, it's like planting a walnut tree, which takes a long time to produce fruit, and a peach tree, which will produce fruit in a few years, and a grapevine, which will again take many, many years to produce a proper crop of stuff. You plant them all at the same time, and then they all start producing fruit at the same time, right? This is the way he describes it. So it's not really the point here, but Lama Tsongkhapa gives some really wonderful advice also, saying that essentially if you combine your study in this way with the Nongdro practices, the preparatory practices for Tantra, then not only are you doing sort of the contemplations, etc., that will purify and create merit if you're following Pavank Rinpoche's advice, but you're also doing all of the things that you can with the body and the speech and the mind in terms of preparatory practices that also purify and create merit, while at the same time preparing the mind to do the more difficult and advanced types of training that are available on the tantric path. So in this way, if one is sort of arranging their life in order to do these studies and trainings properly, or with a great deal of sincerity, you can see how just this much is already like way more than sufficient. If you just have these tools organized properly in your mind, man, I mean, the path will unfold for you, period. If you can do this stuff properly, the rest is just time and effort. So, quite profound. We already talked about subjective objects, blended objects. So again, this really comes from experience, not from a text, but sometimes a new understanding, a fresh understanding of some kind that is a conceptual image comes with some other type of emotional content. And by holding both of those, if you have just a little bit of concentration, it tends to make a big impact, a much bigger impact than if you are only holding the new understanding alone. But that's only from this poor soul here, not from the profound masters. So take it with a grain of salt. Final bit of advice here from J. Pavanka. He says, with regard to actually having to meditate on the Lamrim teachings, this is almost more terrifying than death itself. Most of us would rather spend our lives reading scripture studying Buddhist philosophy, or reciting prayers. But this attitude stems from a lack of understanding about the most crucial elements of Dharma. We cannot be sure that in the future we will find another physical form like the one we now have. Even if we did, it would be extremely difficult to meet the Buddha's teachings again, especially a complete and unerring teaching like that of the second Buddha, Tsongkhapa. So what is he saying? I've always found this to be quite funny. Because it's relatable, right? You go to the retreat, maybe you're hardcore, you spend a month in retreat learning about the Lamrim. You learn day one, ba, 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 ba. You go through the whole thing, you get out super hardcore, and then for like 3 months, you can't stand to study anything, you don't want to do anything, you don't want to sit down, let's not even talk about it, right? You just burn yourself out. Just looking at your cushion, you feel a little nauseous. Just thinking about any aspect of training, you're like, oh, let's slow down. Oh, no. Maybe just thinking about trying to contemplate impermanence one more time, you break out in cold sweats. You're like, oh, gee, oh, man. Right? So this is very relatable stuff. And it's so funny that in the 1800s, Pavanka Rinpoche was telling this to a group of monks and nuns who had showed up at his cave to talk about the Dharma, right? He's saying, most of you would rather just recite texts and study philosophy and clap your hands and do debate and recite prayers, make some offerings, right? But you would almost rather die than actually try to gain the realizations being talked about in these texts. Don't be like those people, yeah? Take the advice. Take the advice. Do the contemplations that are in your system. Follow the methods that are in your system. Understand the methods that are in your system. And the sky is the limit. All of these methods, by and large, work if they're from valid lineages of training in Buddha Dharma. They all have the essence. They're just for different people. So follow the process, do the work, and the results will come in time. Yeah. I mean, if you really want to understand this topic, then Geshe Losopa's commentary on the Chenmo is excellent. The Chenmo is excellent. And a very brief description, but also quite excellent in the middle-length Lamrim by Tsongkhapa. All quite good. This is once again from me, a nobody. But quite frankly, it seems that on most Lamrim topics, there's almost no bottom to how deep you can take the realizations of those topics. Especially from starting from sort of the ordinary perspective. Like, it just seems wacko, I think, that when most people read the stories, right? Like that a great meditator was so concerned that he might waste a few moments, that, he got stabbed in the leg with I can't remember what it was. He got stabbed in the leg with something, and it's like sticking out of his thigh. And he's so worried that he might waste a few moments of his life, because at any moment it could stop and end, that he wouldn't even stop his training to take the wood out of his leg, right? And you go, wow, that's in one way really inspiring, in another way it sounds totally nuts, right? Like, take the thing out of your leg, fix your leg, make sure that you don't die of an infectious disease, and carry on with the work. And I think that's why we need sort of a lay Western person's version of this. Because if you're sitting in a cave doing the highest practices and you're trying to get them done in 3 years or something, okay, yeah, I understand that. But if you need to wake up tomorrow and go to work because you have people depending on you to, Maybe it's better to take the wood out of your leg. Anywho, to carry on. Indeterminacy and underdetermination. So these are fancy scholarly words because I'm a pretentious dick. Indeterminacy and underdetermination. What does this jargon mean? Indeterminacy just means that you can't figure it out, and that it seems to be impenetrable. You may never figure it out until you have the direct experience. Some things are like that. Underdetermination means you don't have enough information right now to know what's going on. And some topics in the Lamrim are like that. Some topics in the training system, for example, with rebirth, you may not, it's my opinion that if you study quite well, and if you look at all the data we have from science and so on, you actually can come to the conclusion quite reasonably that rebirth is real. But there's no way to prove that the realms of rebirth in the way that they're described in Buddhism are real, beyond using sort of yet another scriptural argument that there is a state of realization that is real, right? Which then relies upon a reasoning argument alone, pure reasoning, where you're saying realizations are possible because of such and such and such reasons. And so from a Buddhist perspective, some of these things are underdetermined or indeterminate from where you're sitting today, and that's okay. Some of these arguments you can get very close. There are some topics where when people ask me and they insist, I'll say, I'm like 97% on that. Right? Like the rebirth thing. I'm like 97, 98% convinced that rebirth is a real thing. Pretty much on a given day, it's my default mode is yes, I think that's what's going on. When I think about it in really, 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 really fine detail, I have some points where I go, not sure. But in general, I think rebirth is quite reasonable, quite establishable in terms of argument and scientific evidence and so on. I think these are quite reasonable positions. And there's a lot of different angles you can get in on those. But, you're going through the Lamrim and you get to the karma section, you might have some difficulties. Realms of rebirth, not only might you have difficulties with rebirth, you might have difficulties with realms. Yeah? So you have to be honest about where you're at in your understanding and whether it's based on pure faith, or it's conviction based upon reason, or it's conviction based upon pure reason, or conviction based upon reason that comes from direct experience, right? So you have an experience on which you extrapolate to further experiences. For example, maybe you've trained in meditation for 10 years. You've seen some change in the way your mind works, so you're confident, if I keep going, it will work, right? That's different than in the first year, you've read the map, you have no experience, but you've read the map and you go, wow, the map is quite reasonable. That destination might be real. Versus, I've walked some distance on the map and the map was accurate, right? Those are different. Versus, for some reason, I haven't even seen the map, but I think this is it, which is just faith, just blind faith, coming from I don't know where. So you have to be honest. Do I have blind faith about this issue? Do I have sort of the faith of a person who has a reasonable map? Or do I have the faith of a person who has walked some portion of the map and the map has been accurate? Does that make sense? I hope it does. Also, we need to continually see our training as an ongoing process of defeating our previous understandings. What you think this year will not be what you think, feel, how you're oriented, what your understanding of the subject is in 5 years. It won't be that. if you're striving earnestly. It certainly won't be that in 10 years, 15 years. If it is, then you're missing something. So the purpose of today's training, said Miyamoto Musashi, the great cave-dwelling yogi / undefeated swordsman, is to defeat yesterday's understanding. They also say in the Zen tradition you need to have a beginner's mind, which means that even though your research, your understanding, your level of capability reaches a conclusion for a day or a week or for this year or for a couple of years, right? That you always leave a crack open, like the beginner, to take in new information without letting yourself be stuck in all the pieces that you've already collected. In other words, when you're listening to a new teacher, for example, I recently took on a new teacher, and when you're listening to that teacher, you have to understand what is their idiolect, right? What is their particular way of speaking that is particular to them? How do these expressions relate? How do they organize the path structure in their mind? Blah, 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 blah. But if I'm sitting there going, no, when you say mind means this, it doesn't mean that, it means these 3 characteristics, then I couldn't ever take another teacher again. Right? My mind has been closed because I became an expert, which is a huge error. Okay. So, if you're still with me, you have made it to the end of my first major section in this work. You've made it to the end of what I call learning skills, right? We've covered how do you hear the teachings, listen to them, remember what's been said. That's basically the most major point of this first thing, remembering what's been said and not mixing it with your own sort of nonsense understandings. Second, making those understandings quite rich, so they're not only memorable, but they're nuanced. Hi, buddy. What do you want? Huh? What do you want from me? I'm doing a video. Yeah, I'm doing a video. So those understandings need to be made much more nuanced, more refined. You have a bunch of different sort of angles and approaches. And then throughout this whole process, right, this is not strictly sequential. You need to start the process of familiarization, developing all of the character traits associated with these intellectual understandings that you've been sort of building up. Yeah? So that completes the first major section. Thank you for hanging in there. As I've mentioned previously, in the description below, you will find a link to my OnlyFans for academics, i.e. my Patreon account. The money from that, I have decided, will strictly go towards either supporting my PhD work or supporting my personal practice, meaning that it will fund me attending further retreats or paying for courses and things related to my own Dharma training. And a portion of that, and I'll try to keep it around 10%, if not more, will go towards Dharma donations and causes that are related to the Dharma as well. So it should be quite meaningful in a number of ways if you're so inclined. If you're not so inclined, that's fine as well. I genuinely just want people to get the most out of the traditions they're already involved in. So please continue to tune in regardless of whether you'd like to contribute or not, and I hope this helps. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm just a normal guy. I have an email address. I do answer emails. You can send me a message on whatever platform you'd like, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about this or any other topic that it may seem useful, helpful, whatever, to do so. Okay, thank you for tuning in, and see you again soon.